All right, welcome back. Before I head into lesson 1.2b, I'm going to just quickly finish up with lesson 1.2a. So we left off by taking the green equation over here, rewriting it so that instead of x, we are putting in our solution that we got above from what we learned from 8th grade math. And we're going to go ahead and do order of operations in order to figure out what our y value is. So what I did here is I took negative 2 and I multiplied it by 3.2 and ended up with negative 6.4. And so I still have to add the 3. So when I take negative 6.4 and I add 3, I get a negative 3.4 for my y. So because I know my x is 3.2 and my y is negative 3.4, I can go ahead and write my coordinate point, my one solution coordinate point of 3.2, comma, and there is a little negative sign in there, 3.4. And I can confirm that by looking at my graph. I can see that my meeting point, so if I kind of darken it a little bit right in here, this is my solution, which is 3.2 comma negative 3.4. I can see this is my solution because it's a little past 3 on the x-axis. And then when I go down 1, 2, 3, it's a little bit past negative 3 there as well. So that confirms that that is my final solution. So now into lesson 1.2b. In this lesson, you learned how to identify key features of graphs. Now, whether that graph is a linear function or some other type of graph that we don't have a name for yet, I needed to have you understand what x-intercepts, y-intercepts, maximum, minimum, domain, increasing, decreasing, and range are, so that if I give you any type of graph in the future, you can identify these key features or characteristics as we call them. So what I try to do to help us for notes purposes is I try to organize these to help you realize when you needed to use coordinate points for your notation versus when you needed to use interval notation, which is our brackets or our parentheses, depending on what values we're finding. So because these items all have coordinate points, remember whenever we find one of these four key characteristics or key features for coordinate points, we are always going to use the parentheses, and there will always be an x value and a y value. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight that in yellow because that's going to be important to understand. So when we are looking at or for x-intercepts, where we are looking is where our graph hits the x-axis. So this is where graph hits the x-axis. The y-intercept or y-intercepts then is where our graph hits the y-axis. So where graph hits the y-axis. The maximum then is going to be the highest point of our graph. So highest point of graph. And the opposite of that then is our minimum, which is our lowest point of graph. So usually when you have a maximum, you will not have a minimum, and vice versa. If you have a minimum on your graph, you will not have a maximum. And you'll go more in depth in your future math courses about how to correctly use notation if you don't have a maximum or a minimum. But for now, if we don't have it, we're just going to say no true maximum or no true minimum. So again, for these four key characteristics or key features, you need to write them as coordinate points with an x and a y value using parentheses. The next four key characteristics then is where we use interval notation. So this goes back to one of the lessons in 1.1 where I first introduced you to the domain and range. And we talked about set notation versus interval notation. So for interval notation, remember you can use your brackets or parentheses or a combination of the two. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight these options then. So with interval notation, it does get a little tricky, and so I tried again, besides separating these key features into the two main categories that I currently have them in, I took interval notation and then split those into two main categories as well. For interval notation, you're going to want to look at the x-axis when you are trying to find the domain, increasing and decreasing values. The reason why we look at the x-axis is because when we go to use our brackets and or our parentheses, we need to be looking at the numbers that are on the x-axis. So it's really, really important to clue in your eyes to not only look at the graph like we talked in the past, but also to look at the numbers that are on the x-axis. So for the domain, remember, these are our input values. For where the graph is increasing, we want to look at where the graph goes up. And where the graph is decreasing, we then want to look and see if there's any parts of where the graph goes down. So then finally, we go ahead and look at the y-axis for only one key feature, and that is the range. So the range, remember, deals with our output values. So in the next video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a graph of a function and a non-function, and we are going to go ahead and practice identifying these key features. So what you're going to need to make sure that you have for the next video is 2 pieces of graph paper.